This week we're going to do something a little different. It's going to feature an old friend of ours, Mike Metlay, who's the editor at Recording Magazine, but just a good friend of mine and somebody who's been doing electronic music and media arts for quite a while. In this one, Mike and I kind of explore the whole magazine thing, what made magazines exciting, not just gear magazines, but fanzines as well, how those influenced the direction of the music, and how they, in some cases, were even star makers for the people who became the people that we all know. So I hope that you enjoy this. I'll catch you on the backside. This week we are going to spend a little time with the A+M+T official historian of all things media related, and that is our friend Mike Metlay. Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Darwin. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's great fun, and this time we're not driving. We are sitting in your office at Recording Magazine, which is actually really important because one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the influence of the magazines that we grew up on the art that we ended up doing. And so, this is going to be casting back in the wayback machine. Anyone under 40 isn't even going to remember half of this stuff, but that's okay because you're going to understand where some of it comes from and where some of the prejudices and where some of the love for gear actually comes from. So,
now, I got started in the late 70s. I first got interested in electronic music, well, actually much earlier than that, although I didn't put two and two together until I was much older. My older brother actually owned a copy of Switched On Bach, which I have a copy of on LP tacked to my wall in my office. And I heard it when I was 8 years old, and it basically blew the top off my skull. But I didn't know what I was listening to. It's very interesting. The history of my music career has been this whole disconnect between these really cool things that I hear and the understanding that maybe I could be doing it myself.
Right.
And at some point or another, in the last interview, we actually didn't talk much about my musical past, which is fine. But at some point or another, it would be a very amusing story for me to tell about some of the incredible blind alleys I went down before I became an electronic musician. Spent a lot of money, spent a lot of time, spent a lot of heartache trying to get at something without realizing what it was I was trying to get at. But in the 70s, when I was getting started in high school, the big influences then were the music that the stoners listened to, and that was Tangerine Dream and Jean-Michel Jarre. So, I was, 16, 17, and was first exposed to albums that are nowadays considered, the classics. Equinox and Oxygen by Jarre, and unlike most people, I actually was introduced to Equinox first. It's still my favorite electronic music album of all time. It was released in 78, and I discovered it in 79. And then the mid-70s, the all-star lineup of Tangerine Dream, which was Edgar Frizza of blessed memory, with Chris Franca and Peter Baumann. And those were albums like Rubicon, again, which I discovered Rubicon before I discovered Phaedra, which makes me weird. Ricochet.
Actually, I did though too. So
it's a great record.
Oh, it is. Great record. What a great intro. Right?
And the point is that there was this stuff available, and there was this community that was coming out, and a real interest in finding out more. And a lot of your listeners, I think, are of a generation where there's always been Google.
Right.
And actually, I saw a very funny cartoon the other day of, what life was like before the internet. And it was two people sitting on a couch, and one of them was saying, I just thought of something that I'd like to know more about. And the other person says, oh, really? Yeah, damn shame.
Right.
Because you couldn't just find stuff out.
Yeah.
And actually, the whole thesis of what we're going to be talking about is the fact that it was really difficult to find stuff out. You really had to work to get the information. Whether it was
that's a great point. Right.
Whether it was the gear or, as we'll talk about later, I hope, the community.
Right.
Finding out about other electronic musicians before the internet was hard. It was doable. And there was a tremendous cottage industry run by some really selfless people who put in a lot of late nights. But we're spoiled now for being able to reach out and connect with people. And there are downsides to that too. But in the 70s and the early 80s, I went to Oberlin College. I was not at the Conservatory of Music. I was actually a science major. But I did a lot of work at the con. And my early training was actually in the electronic music studios, the Tamara program, which is well known.
I remember that.
At the time, it was Gary Lee Nelson and Conrad Cummings. Gary and I still talk every once in a great while. At the time, though, I was this kid from outside the program. The funny thing is, I could have been qualified because they didn't ask for much. All they wanted was music theory as a co-requisite.
Okay.
But I didn't bother actually taking the music theory course. So the only time I got in the studios in the basement was stolen, actually. Right. I would sneak in with friends who were allowed to be in there, and I'd mess. They had a small Buchla Series 100, I think. They had a little Moog System 35, and then, of course, the ubiquitous academic teaching machine for electronic music at Oberlin. They had a bunch of them, and God knows what happened to them. Was the EMS VCS3?
Right.
They had a bunch of the Putneys with the Cricklewood the Cricklewood keyboard, which was the piano style keyboard.
Right.
They did not have the keyboard sequencer, which probably would have changed my life.
Oh, sure. Of
because
course, right.
I didn't have access to sequencing until about 1981, and the whole thing at the time was if you wanted to learn about this stuff and you didn't have the equipment right there in front of you. And they had a decent rig. They actually, the Hal Alice digital synthesizer, which was one of the first big things that was developed, and it was at Bell Labs, I guess,
right.
was actually at Oberlin. And there's a picture of on the first Don Slepian album of him messing around on the Bell Labs. I don't know if they ever got the Alice synthesizer working. There was a rumor going around, and this is a rumor, no proof to it, that it got to Oberlin and somebody decided they could improve it and they took it apart and they couldn't get it back together again. It certainly wasn't working when I was there.
Right.
But they were doing early sequencing, early computer-based music generation. My real education came in 1984 at the University of Pittsburgh. Actually, I was able to do a little bit of work. I recorded some early works while I was at Oberlin with borrowed gear. But in 1984, 1985, before I started my graduate career, I had a year as a post-baccalaureate student for free because my father, God rest his soul, had been a faculty member, and I had tuition if I wanted it. And I took a year of music courses. And that was when I got my music theory and my composition, my rudimentary piano technique. And that was when I worked with a truly great electronic musician who is not nearly as well known historically as he should be. A fellow by the name of A. Wayne Slauson, who went from Pitt to UC Irvine. I believe he's an emeritus professor and he's now retired. I exchanged emails with him a couple of years ago and he was thrilled to find out that I was still doing this stuff. He was a former colleague of Gordon Mumma and had done a lot of really cool stuff. And he was one of these people who had this joy, this incredible enthusiasm for the music. So in this period, from high school to Oberlin to Pitt to setting up my first studio, there's this 5-6 year period where I was absorbing information like a sponge. And the magazines were critical for that because they were your only vector. If you wanted to learn about gear, the way you did it was you went down to the newsstand or you had a subscription, you picked up the magazines, you read them cover to cover, you pored over the ads because the ads had all the stuff you wanted to know about. And back in the old days, they didn't do this whole, 21st century, a full page ad of nothing but a picture of a piece of gear and a name. You would have ads.
It's like an encyclopedia.
Yeah, an ad would have a small picture of the gear and paragraphs of what it did.
Feature, right.
And you'd learn a lot from the ads. And a big shout out to the people who wrote these early magazines. In the late 70s, early 80s, the one that was really useful was a little magazine published out of a basement in Oklahoma called Polyphony,
right,
which was Craig Anderton's first foray into publishing. I have a huge library of these old magazines. I've never gotten rid of any of them, although a couple of my best ones have been stolen. But I have the original first two editions of Electronic Musician, which is what Polyphony became before Mix bought them, and they became a fully distributed national magazine. There are actually 2 issues of Electronic Musician that Anderton published in full color,
Really?
on good paper.
Because Polyphony, wasn't that kind of spun out of the Paya?
Yes. He had worked with John Simonton and with the folks at Paya. He was designing a lot of these, the early quad fuzz boxes.
Oh, dude,
and
I
things
remember my first experience with electronics was building this little mixer,
Yeah.
For a band I was in. We used it, and it was great.
Yeah. He was and is a great designer and a great educator. And I owe him a lot. I am very lucky that over the years he went from this unapproachable guy that wrote these magazines that I lived off of to a colleague.
Right.
And just a neat guy.
Yeah.
But at the time, he was a source for this information that you couldn't get anywhere else. So you had, of course, the grand old man of these gear magazines was Keyboard, which had gotten started in the 70s. And
as contemporary keyboard.
Keyboard, CK, right. as
CK,
us old
right.
as us oldsters know it. And you had fantastic people writing for it. Dominic Milano, Jim Aiken, and Bob Moog actually had a column for a long time.
That's right, I forgot about
And Wendy Carlos wrote for them occasionally, and then you had keyboardists in more traditional. Bill Irwin had not Bill Irwin. Sorry, he's somebody else. Bill Evans. Bill Evans had a and they would talk about the stuff that was really important. Piano pedagogy. David L. Burge, not David L. Burge, who did The Perfect Pitch. The other David Burge, who was the educator, did a column on classical piano. For years.
I forgot about The Perfect Pitch.
Yeah,
okay.
but just great people with lots of wisdom.
Sure.
And back then there was no electronica. There was no community that was focused only on synthesizers yet. So if you wanted to learn about the new gear and you wanted to learn about synths, and this is something which people take for granted and do not really understand the value of, you were exposed to a wide range of musical styles that you wouldn't have gotten to otherwise.
Yeah, that's really important point because for me, my entree into this stuff was a friend of mine who was a big ELP fan. I was a guitar player, right? And my friend in college, Tim Wheeler, love the man, he introduced me to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I see Rick Wakeman over there.
Oh, yeah.
Early Yes, and Genesis, and a lot of things that really kind of opened my mind, but also opened me up a little bit to the canon of literature, but mainly showed me the places in music stores where you would go and actually see the stuff. Because so often, I mean, that's the other thing that was influential was music stores.
Oh, yes.
You were led down the path of whatever lines that they carried, right?
Yeah.
So, like, for example, this is... I got to know Tim when we were both going to school in Arkansas. The nearest good music store was in Oklahoma City. Or no, in Tulsa. So we drive over to Tulsa to go to this place where the line that they carried was Oberheim stuff.
Right.
So we fell in love with Oberheim and the Oberheim sequencer and drum machines and all of this kind of stuff.
You could do worse.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounded gorgeous, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, never saw a Moog until years later, right? Never saw an ARP until years later because the main influence at the time was the store that we could go to, right?
And the thing is, the difference between thee and me is you had to drive all the way to Tulsa. I came up in Pittsburgh.
Right.
And Pittsburgh had 3 or 4 really good music stores, some of which are still open. But, Pittsburgh has been very good to the mom and pop music stores. So I believe Swissvale Music, God love you guys if you're out there listening to this, is still open, and Hollywood Music down on the south side. And Hollywood's was actually a tragedy. They in the mid to late 80s had a really bad fire in the store, and a lot of used gear that they had on display for sale was destroyed. And I'm still kicking myself to this very day. They had a Yamaha DX1 for $1,000, and I couldn't afford it.
True unobtainium.
Absolute unobtainium. $14,000 keyboard with a polyphonic aftertouch keyboard, burned.
Oh my God.
But this was the thing. In a big city, you could go here and there. Oh, and pianos and stuff. Huey, hi Huey, pianos and stuff.
I actually remember them.
Oh,
they used to advertise in Keyboard Magazine.
Absolutely, they did. Great store. So there were a lot of people. In fact, one of the guys at Pianos and Stuff now still works at West LA Music.
Oh, really?
And those were the things. You would read the classified ads, and there were all these retailers who, for a little extra money, would send you gear.
Right.
And if you couldn't find it locally, but that was a huge risk. Yeah. You put your money down, you sent them a money order or a cashier's check. And
hope something would show up.
Well, and not hope that something would show up. These people were all fairly reliable. The problem was hoping that when it showed up, it was actually what you wanted and what you needed. Because if you couldn't get to the stuff to try it yourself, and it's even today, Guitar Center talks about the kid who comes in and plays every guitar in the store. But when you're talking about synthesizers, when you're talking about a $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 investment, you can't be surprised if the kid's in the store playing all the time for weeks, trying to determine if he wants to put his money down. And the magazines were invaluable about teaching you what to look for, how to look for it.
What are the things? What are common mistakes? I mean, you'd see once you'd read the reviews for a while, you'd come to know that the reviewers, they would tell you things like, well, the mixer clips the sound, and so everything sounds dirty. And if you don't want that, you don't want this,
Right.
And by saying that, it would clue you into what to check out. Even if it wasn't stuff they were reviewing, it clued you into the things that were important, or the things to at least consider that as a neophyte you might never know.
Yeah, it's something as simple as I've plugged in my Oberheim sustain pedal to this Yamaha, and it's working backwards. Why?
Right.
Yeah. I've still got a Yamaha pedal lying around that I opened up and rewired backwards so that it would work on my Oberheim.
Sure.
It's something as simple as that. There are differing standards for normally open, normally closed, voltage standards, scaling standards.
Plug orientation. I remember that being actually a big fight. Roland does it this way, and everyone else does it that way. And who does Roland think they are?
Who does Roland think they are? But then you get into the more serious stuff, like which of the two non-ground pins on an XLR is hot,
right?
And which one's neutral? Because most of the world was pin 2 hot, but there was some really good gear coming out of England that was pin 3 hot. And you could screw yourself if you had that backwards. And the magazines were where you went. And one of the other big advantages of this was magazines had to make sure that they kept their readership up so that they could please their advertisers. And even today, running recording, this is something which I don't think a lot of people value as much as they used to. We have to answer to somebody.
Right.
When we publish something, when we put something in print, it's got to be well thought out and it's got to be right. If you make a mistake in a magazine, it's indelible.
Right.
And the problem is the internet basically lets any douche nozzle with an opinion get out there and say something off the top of his head. Recording has a tradition. Every April we do an April Fool's article. And we've had some buttes. There's actually at least one entire class of products on the market right now that originated as an April Fool's article in our magazine. Somebody actually said, well, it was funny when I read it, but it'd actually be kind of cool to see what it sounds like. Bit crushers.
Oh.
In April 1995, we had a box called the Prestidigitator, which gave you that cold digital sound whenever you wanted it by reducing bit depth.
Right.
And Opcode came out with Lo-Fi soon after that, and now bit crushers are everywhere. So it was us. But this year, the point I'm making, this year we're not doing an April Fool's article. We're doing an anti-April Fool's article. Scott Dorsey, who is this phenomenal electrical engineer and mic guru, who has forgotten far more than most people know about microphones and about music electronics, wrote us a really nice article about this, quote, everybody knows, end quote, bit of wisdom that's being passed around on the internet by people who supposedly are experts, which is utter bilge. And he's doing an anti-April Fool article. This should be an April Fool's joke, but there are people who are taking it seriously. And this is really the role of the magazine. One of the reasons why I'm a magazine editor today is it was ingrained into me from very young. The magazine was the place where you went to get knowledge you could trust.
Right.
You would always run into people who had an agenda, who would tell you that such and such worked a certain way, and you should use it because of that. I got into a horrific argument on the floor of Sam Ash Music in New York City in 1982 with a salesman who was pitching a piece of gear that didn't work. But he was making an extra commission because he was actually in cahoots with the manufacturer. He's still in the industry, and I see him at every NAMM show, so I'm not going to name names. But the point is, you would run into these people who had an axe to grind, who had an agenda. Maybe they had a particular love of a piece of gear, and they, for whatever reason, they didn't like something that would have been better suited to you. Or they were making a better commission if they sold X rather than Y. Right. And it was very important to be able to develop your own knowledge base. And the reason why I respect the magazine so much is because they were the vector. They were the way you got the knowledge into your head. And 5 years of assiduously reading Polyphony and Keyboard, those were the early ones. And then Electronic Musician came along in 85 and went national in 86 with its third issue. That was where the knowledge came from. That was how you knew what to look at, because there were textbooks in electronic music, and they were useful for things like deep theory. But for learning your way around gear, they were outdated by the time they hit the
I was going to say, one of the things I wanted to kind of touch on was how quick things are moving. I mean, I remember actually excitedly waiting for the release of a book that was going to clue me in on stuff, and the second that it came out, I would get it, and they were talking about gear that you couldn't even buy anymore because it was so done. Things were changing. I mean, that was back when you couldn't wait for Summer NAMM because everything would change between Winter NAMM and Summer NAMM, right? And then Summer NAMM would be done, and you'd be like, well, I wonder what's going to be at Winter NAMM, where everything changes again, right? I mean, things were changing so fast. Stuff would come and disappear so quickly.
And the problem was, and this is something which is probably worth an entire podcast in and of itself, the gear manufacturers were still learning the ropes.
Right.
One of the things that everybody who does stuff nowadays, whether it's keyboards, MIDI, or modular, is that we have the benefit of 3 decades of having made mistakes and learned from them. The big push in the late 70s and the early 80s, this is before MIDI, was to figure out how to get the tools of synthesis into the hands of your average bar gig keyboardist without having him have to mortgage his house. The Prophet 5 was a wonderful, amazing, seminal box that changed everything. Dave Smith's a genius, still is, always has been, but it was $5,000.
Yeah, it was that was like the better part of the house.
$5,000 in 1978. It was a lot of money. Yeah. A Yamaha CS80 was more.
Right.
If you wanted to do this in the 70s, it was the province of the guys with the major label deals who had advances that could buy the stuff in tens of thousands of dollars. You would pay $3,000-$4,000 for a Mellotron, and regret it ever since. Love-hate relationship with the Mellotron is a whole podcast in and of itself. But, and the thing is, you were always looking, what could you get for this? And you would get these instruments, and people were saying, well, okay, X didn't work very well, let's try Y. And, one of the fascinations I had coming up in the 70s and 80s was this idea that stuff could be repackaged and reworked with a new interface in a way that made it easier to work with. One of my favorite examples was a synth that I was able to pick up at Hollowoods before the fire. I kept it for a while, really loved it, but realized that I couldn't make good use of it. I sold it to a friend who still has it today. It was the ARP Quadra.
Yeah.
The Quadra was 4 different synthesizers from ARP's lineup put in the same case with a unified interface. And it was a kludge. It was a really bizarre instrument, but it sounded great. I mean, it's all over the stuff from Genesis in the era when they were really getting famous. It's the polysynth on Abacab. But it was just a great little machine. But then you had these companies that were trying to figure out how they could cut corners. And in 81, 82, 83, there was this real push for, let's take away the user interface and do everything with a couple of buttons and an LED display. Not even an LCD with words, but 2 digits, you know? And companies like the Italians, Seal, would do these machines. And listen, the DK600 was a great synthesizer, but then they wanted to figure out a way to make it cheaper. And they took off the front panel, and by God, they saved a lot of money, but you couldn't program the damn thing anymore.
Yeah, there was a whole class of sequential things that were like
that. The 6-track.
The 6-track was the one that killed me. I wanted that to be good so badly.
Oh, it sounded great if you could program it.
Right, and it was...
one knob.
I wanted to eat a gun every time I tried
Oh, God, it was
song.
horrible. But I lusted after that machine, but because it was multi-timbral.
Multi-timbral, right.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted it, because... You know, it was like you could make the most out of your MIDI sequencer if you could get that thing going.
Exactly. Multi-timbrality was a big deal. And the early digital synths, where we started to see this affordability, we started to see, you know, all of a sudden you could get a real polyphonic synthesizer for under $2,000. And that was something that a keyboardist who was gigging and working as a professional could manage. You know, if you had a Help and Still portable upright, if you had an RMI Roxachord, if you had a Rhodes, if you had a Farfisa organ or a Vox Supercontinental, you could do a synth for $1,000, $1,500, and it didn't have to be one of the little mono synths like the ARP Solus or the Mini Korg. Or the Krumar Multiman stuff.
Right.
The Multivox synthesizers, which nobody remembers anymore. The ARP Solus.
Yeah, ARP Solus. Even the
A lot
of people would kind of like scam their way into it by getting something like an ARP Omni or something like that. And it had a filter cutoff, so you could get something that sounded kind of polysynthy.
Or the Radio Shack. How many people...
the MG1.
The MG1. How many... It designed by Moog. It was a great...
I love that
great little keyboard. And, you know, I had a Moog Liberation, which had an MG1 as part of the... As part of the implementation. Thing weighed a ton, but it was incredibly expressive.
Yeah.
But the point is, there was this huge proliferation, but nowadays we're used to the fact that everybody understands how this stuff works. Circuit design is well understood. What works and what doesn't work in UI is relatively understood. What was successful and what was not successful is well understood. But in the 70s and 80s, we were learning as we went. The gear manufacturers were learning as they went. And if they screwed up, you paid $1,000 to eat their mistake.
Yeah.
So knowing what you knew was critical. And the guys at these magazines had godlike powers when it came to teaching people what they needed to know or not know, so that when they shelled out a month's salary for a keyboard, they would have something they could actually use.
Well, and it's interesting because you talk about a $2,000 keyboard. If you were in a great band, that still represented 40 gigs.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because that's how much you were getting paid at the time for doing a gig. Right?
And this was in the era where the real money to do this stuff came from the labels.
Right.
If you didn't, this was the reason why getting signed was so important.
It was so important because you couldn't get gear to be professional. It's funny because I remember actually, and you talk about poring over these magazines. And I mean, it was to the point where you would read and think about every one of the letters to the editor. Mm-hmm. Letters to the editor turned out to be really important because that was the feedback. That was the sole feedback mechanism.
And it was so slow.
Oh, geez, unreal. Yeah.
You know, a magazine was published once a month.
Right.
If someone wrote a controversial article, you wouldn't hear back about it, and there would be conversations for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. So you had to be incredibly patient.
Right.
And you had to take the knowledge as it came to you. But here's the thing. The speed of knowledge was a trickle rather than a fire hose. But the knowledge you got was all good.
Was super deep and high quality, right?
Because it was vetted before it went to print. And the problem with the internet is that it democratized the transmission of information to the point where you can find out anything in a hurry, but most of what you find out is garbage.
Well, I don't know that that's... I think that that's very dependent on what you use for your source of information.
Yes, but how do you learn if you're just starting out what's a reliable source and what isn't?
I would agree with that.
You know?
And I pity the people that are, just starting out and they jump into the wrong forum on REP or
exactly. Or
catch the wrong thread off of Matrix synth or something.
Exactly. or start randomly picking YouTube videos based on the wrong tags.
Right.
And you can get horrible damage done to you.
Can.
But the beautiful thing about that now, which I'll come back to in a little bit, is now we have the whole explosion of meetups and makerspaces.
Right.
Which allow you to get together with like-minded people and learn for yourself what works and what doesn't. But to get back to the magazines, you got used to getting good information at a slow pace and having time to digest it and work with it. John Curtis, who is now a senior librarian at Baldwin Wallace in Ohio, was my roommate in college, and he and I worked together for a lot of my early music. He's on a couple of the Team Metlay records, great guitarist, really, really nice guy, and a good synthesist. And he and I chipped in together so that we could buy our first synthesizer, which was a Sequential Circuits Pro 1. Mm-hmm. Now, the Pro 1 was a monophonic synthesizer, which had an arpeggiator and a 40-step sequencer. And you could do anything with that machine. That machine it opened the doors to us. Because, of course, the VCS3 was great for textural stuff, but it didn't track pitch for shit.
Right.
So having a keyboard on it was more of a sort of an act of...
It was a cruel joke.
It was a cruel joke and an act of dewy-eyed optimism. And so if you wanted to actually do tonal stuff, you needed something that had better tracking.
Right.
And I ended up buying the synth off of John and having it for a while. My first synth that I bought on my own, which took a windfall from a relative who said, I'm going to give you a little money and I want to see how you invest it in your future. And I went out and bought an Oberheim expander.
and there you go.
Well, years later, he was quite elderly, and I visited him. And I said, you remember that money you gave me? And he was like, yeah. And I said, it turned into a career.
Yeah.
And I said, you could not have, thank you for letting me do... Rather than telling me to do X with it, you let me do what I needed to do. Right. And it jump-started me. Right. But I would never have done it. I would never have even realized how important that funny-looking black box was if I hadn't had 6 years of this magazine under my belt to understand what made it so special. And that really... So that's one whole facet of the early years, was the fact that this gear information... Yes, it was advertiser-driven, but it was high quality, and it came at a pace where you could digest it.
Right. Well, and digest it in depth. Now, I want to talk about what you just said, though, because this use of the expander is actually the point at which you also first became a publisher.
Oh, yes. That segues into how community was done before the internet. The last time we talked a lot about the development of communities on the nascent internet.
Right.
Now we're going to step into the Wayback Machine, and we're going to go back to before the internet existed. When you heard this stuff, when you found an LP in a music store, and it sang to you, and it opened your brain, and you said, I've got to do this myself. How do I start? Magazines like Keyboard and Electronic Musician and Music Technology in the UK, right, which later became Home and Studio Recording, which actually got folded into Home and Studio Recording, which later became Recording Magazine, which of course is still around today in its 28th year. Mm-hmm. Sound on Sound, got to give props to them. And of course, there were a lot of magazines in Germany and throughout the Belgium and the Netherlands, and of course all the Japanese stuff. Right. Not to mention, the print magazines that the big manufacturers put out to promote their own stuff, like Aftertouch, which was Yamaha's magazine.
I learned so much recording technique from the early magazines that Tascam put out.
Oh, yeah.
Their little booklets and stuff.
Exactly.
Like that was another thing. I mean, those kind of things, we didn't treat them like, oh, that's coming from the manufacturer. You were like, oh my God, the manufacturer's helping out.
Yes, because we needed it.
We needed anything.
The classic one, Roland Users Group, had what, a 14-year run?
Oh, they were around forever.
And it was a
collection of
and they had bunches and bunches of tutorials. Great stuff. Yeah, of course it was Roland centric. Big whoop. It still taught you what to do. Right. Korg did one for a while. ProView,
that's it.
And you learned from this stuff. Right. But the thing is, if a company didn't have a magazine, you did it yourself. And I got started in publishing with a magazine that I created called Expansions, which was for Oberheim users. And it mostly focused on the Expander and Matrix 12, but occasionally we talk about other stuff. It had a spin-off. I did another magazine called Vectory, which was for vector synths, which was the Yamaha SY22, the Korg Wave Station, and the Sequential Prophet VS. At one point, I actually owned all three of them MIDI together, and that was it was
Joystick Central.
Minutes of endless amusement. But the point was, people would write in, and they would get this magazine, and they'd pay a little bit of money for a subscription, and we would hand print these. Lionel Casson, who now he's still doing music, but he was a great friend back in the 80s, and he had a laser printer.
Oh my.
He had an actual Apple laser writer, $5,000 investment, and he would do PageMaker and lay out this magazine for me, and I'd approve it, and then we'd duplicate it at a copy shop and email it out, mail it out in envelopes.
Email. You can't even not say email anymore.
Not yet. But and it ran from 85 to 89. We did it quarterly, and I did about a dozen issues, I guess, and made a lot of friends, people who I'm still in contact with, and contacted a number of other folks. I've still got a letter somewhere in a box in my studio. Dear Mike, you may remember me from when we were, when I sold you your Oberheim Expander. I'm at Pi Keyboards and Audio in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'd really like to be getting the Expansions mailing list, because I'm really interested in the Expander, and I'm doing some work with it on a project. Right. Signed Trent Reznor. Right. But it wasn't just Trent. I mean, Steve Roach was a member. Alan Holdsworth was a member. He used the Matrix 12 with his Synthax.
Oh, of course, because you could use that in that multi-timbre.
Exactly. And so his album Sand was all Synthax and Matrix 12.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And Holdsworth was a great guy. I ended up finally meeting him years later. And you remember the newsletter, which I was a little flattered. He's
notorious as a great guy. So
he is. Cool. He's a fantastic fellow. But then there were other people who were just getting started. Joe McGinty was this keyboardist from New Jersey that nobody had ever heard of. He ended up touring with the Psychedelic Furs, and he's done God knows what else. But I think my favorite, I'm just a guy, getting started who'd like to be involved, Carter Burwell. I've got letters from Carter Burwell, and he's up for Oscars now. Doing soundtrack work, just this community, and these people were they became, a lot of them became friends, and they were a lot of the folks that I contacted via the internet when I got access and who became members of some of my early musical projects.
Right.
You know, Dan Barrett, who was on the first Team Metlay album.
He ended up going on to write for a magazine, didn't he?
He actually wrote books, and I don't know if he's still doing music. You know, they've ended up in all sorts of places.
Right, yeah.
But it was a big deal, and that was how it was done. And beyond the gear related magazines, the mailing lists that people would do on their own, what was really important were the print fanzines.
Yeah.
You know, we could talk about Electronotes, but I think other people have done that in other podcasts.
Well, before we go there, I want to talk a little bit more about this kind of user-driven stuff. So, like, I wasn't an expander user, so I wasn't a big expansions guy until later, where you kind of did me a solid and gave me all the old issues when I was getting into it. Where I ran into it, some of my first synths that I had were I didn't really get into synths because I was a guitarist, so I didn't get into synths until later under MIDI, where I was using them as composition tools, right? And so my first synths were an Ensoniq ESQ1 and an Ensoniq DSK.
The Mirage DSK, right. That's their second one. The Mirage was the first one.
Yeah, the Mirage was the first one, but it was just
like... it was like 8-bit samples on floppy disks.
Oh, yeah. Well, there you go. Living large, right?
Hey, man. Compared to a Mellotron... Yeah. It only cost $1,600. You could pick it up in one hand, and it always worked.
It always worked, right. Well, not only that, but you had this great magazine.
Yes.
That,
who put that out?
I don't even remember.
It was great. It covered...
sort of... You know, Ensoniq didn't run it.
No, Ensoniq did not run it.
Patting them on the back to let it go.
Oberheim did the same thing with expansions.
Yeah. Well, it was really interesting because that existed, then all of a sudden you would get people who were like doing sound design work, and they had a place to talk about their work. It wouldn't make sense if you were making soundware for the Mirage. Even though the Mirage was a big seller, putting an ad in Keyboard Magazine would have been a pretty big waste, right? But if you put a little ad in this Ensoniq user group thing,
yeah. And it's killing me because it was the example. I mean, when I was publishing expansions, I looked up to that magazine because the people who did it did a really good job.
There's a computer right there. What's the name of it?
It's not coming up right away. But the point is that there were some pretty amazing things out there.
So in addition to like doing, being able to promote soundware, like sound sample sets, it wasn't even soundware at the point. But there was, I can't remember the name of them. Was it maybe like Sound Boys or something like that? Actually made alternative audio engines that would run on the Ensoniq thing. There was like weird.
The real yeah. There were people who were writing alternative operating systems,
right? Yeah,
and actually burning them onto ROMs. Yeah. The famous one there was Yamaha had created a rack mount sampler called the TX16W, which had this utterly opaque operating system that nobody, including the engineers at Yamaha, could use.
Figure out, right?
And someone wrote an operating system called Typhoon, which actually made it a very usable sampler.
Well, and everyone talked about how wonderful that thing sounded.
Yeah, it was 16-bit, but you couldn't use it.
So many people, again, that was one of those things where the magazines pretty much went out there and said, sounds great, you'll never figure out how to use it. Yeah. Right? And unfortunately, the Typhoon thing came along too late to save that.
Yeah, to save it as a widespread product. Right. But a lot of people who owned them were no longer weeping tears of blood and rage because they could actually use the thing. But this was the thing, and I'm going to keep dragging you back to this next phase, which is the gear allowed you to learn to use the stuff, but then you also had this place where the magazines became the place where enthusiasts and the audience began to interface with the professionals. And there was a whole set of these electronic music review magazines and fanzines that would come out. The group Electronic Dreams from Portland, Oregon had not, and by group I mean publishing group. They had a magazine called Dreams Word, which ran forever, and you would go to Dreams Word to read reviews of LPs before you bought them to see if they were any good. And that was a very interesting thing because you would have these people who would develop their reviewing style, and someone who was just getting started could be made or broken by a good or bad review in those zines. The first Team Metlay CD got a really mediocre review in Dream's Word, basically because we made the mistake of listing all our gear. And the guy basically said, I can't hear all the gear on every track, and so the album's no good. Nice. Yeah, but there were a lot of these magazines. In New Jersey, there was Synthetic Pleasure.
Right. Well, this actually came up in my discussions with Keith Fulcher and Whitman. Mm-hmm. We were kind of like talking about how, if you think about it, it's almost like a parallel, like a William Gibson style parallel world of community engagement, but one that uses this antiquated, by today's standards, antiquated medium. It allowed it, because I think one of the things that happened as a result of those fanzines is it generated people who would write and could write. And it opened the door to community of, again, a thing that was really important to me was the ability to interface with other synth people without having to live in a city with a huge synth community.
Now, let me ask you this. Here's one for the real old guys. Do you remember Clem? And your stunned silence is all the answer I need. There's Clem, KLEM, which is an electronic music festival in the Netherlands that's been going on for donkey's years. But I'm talking about CLEM. Clem was the contact list for electronic music. It was this enormous phone book.
Actually, you lent me one.
Yes,
that I
the
copied.
very last one they ever published.
It was unbelievable to see the names in there.
Yes,
oh my God.
Back in the day, before the internet, if you wanted to network with these people, the lingua franca was the international reply coupon, the IRC. You would buy these at your post office. Any post office in the world had them. Over 100 countries had them. And you would get it, you'd pay for it, you'd get it stamped with the postmark of your host country. You would put it in an envelope to someone in another country, and their materials would be guaranteed postage back to you. So the thing you did was, you didn't, email me or check out my website. It was, send me an IRC. And if you sent...
That was the international version of the self-addressed stamped envelope.
Exactly. And you'd get one of these IRCs and you'd get back whatever material, and it could be from a record label. And by the way, a record label meaning a guy in his basement.
Right.
Or from another fan. And Clem collected, you would find out about other magazines. I mentioned Dream's Word. I mentioned Synthetic Pleasure. There was Synthesis, which, there was IE, which was late to the game, but was still a very important magazine. I'm forgetting a really, really important one. There was, of course, there were the UK magazines, some of which are still going strong today. But I'm blanking on a really... Dream's Word, Synthetic Pleasure... Oh, Sign! S-Y-N-E. James Finch is still out there, still kicking. But he did a quarterly magazine out of upstate New York that collected a lot of great music, great reviews, very engaged, very readable. And I mourned when that magazine stopped publishing. The very last thing he did, and nowadays he'd probably be sued for it, but in the 80s, when he knew he was going out of business, he took the entire Sign mailing list and published it in the last issue so that the people could stay in contact with each other. And that was so important, because if you read these little classified ads that ran, there was a guy named Ian Boddy who had his very first cassette, The Climb.
Oh my God.
Steve Roach had his very first cassettes in there. You had people like Mark Shreve, who were just getting started in the UK. You had Neil Nappa, who went on, actually, he never released another album after July, but boy, that record was good. Did it, self-published it on a cassette, eventually got re-released on Passport Records on the Synergy label. Larry Fast.
Larry Fast crew,
but there were these people out there, and then there were people who were trying really hard and who ended up actually, writing for magazines and so forth, who never made an impact. But at the time, they were also folks that you cared about. Pauline Anna Strom, she was a legally blind lady who played electronic music on a DX7 that she had fitted out with Braille stickers on the membrane keyboard so she could find her way around. And she did a cassette called Transmillennia Consort. You'd never hear about something like that today. Great music. And the Nightcrawlers, you know.
Yeah. You introduced me to that when I was blown away.
Oh, but the thing is, this was the beginning of the cassette culture. These guys did 50 albums. And the way they did them, and one of the reasons why their stuff sounded so good, they did it because they had to. And it wasn't until years later that everybody figured out why the early Nightcrawler stuff sounded so great. It's because they played it live on open-air microphones and recorded it in stereo, and the room was the mixer.
Right.
And their stuff sounded great. Oh, not all of it was fantastic. They put out some stuff that was actually, fairly pedestrian. But the stuff that made it onto the collection traveling backwards on Mannequin Records, double CD, still available, was that was all three of their LPs. Collected in one place, and
amazing.
And it really, really good stuff.
Yeah.
And that was a prime example of three guys in a basement in New Jersey who had a nice collection of monophonic synths and early polyphonic synths and a couple of organs and things like that with a mixer, and they didn't even have a 4-track. Everything was done in stereo. And they just burned cassettes and sent them on out.
Now, to what extent do you think things like the fanzines and stuff like that were responsible for the direction that things went, either good or bad? So, I mean, and it can be all over the map, because, first of all, I had done a little study that didn't actually go anywhere, but I had done a little study in electronic music when I was doing my master's degree, and you shared with me a bunch of your old fanzines. And it was really interesting because I got an opportunity to see electronic music as it moved towards New Age.
Uh-huh.
And electronic music as another splinter group moved into space music.
Mm-hmm.
And another group as it moved into techno.
Oh, the kids in Detroit. I have the very first Cybertron LP, and it was reviewed in Keyboard Magazine. They're like, "We don't get it." That was a classic review. Actually, there's some absolutely amazing classic albums that got some really pretty crummy reviews in Keyboard.
Yeah, well, Keyboard was smart to just give up on album reviews.
Well,
because who's to know, right?
Well, exactly. But the Robert Carlberg was a tastemaker in Electronic Musician magazine for years. He eventually he went down in flames because he tried an experiment that actually turned out really, really badly.
This is what?
He did a contest called I Want to Be a Cheesehead. He said, I've got so many submissions now. This is 1988, 1989, I think. I got so many submissions now, I can't possibly review them all. So send me your name. Send me a Xerox copy of your driver's license, so I know your name and your address. I'll send you an album, you review it, and send me your reviews.
Oh.
And so he crowdsourced reviews, and all these people wanted to show, how brilliant they were. And savaged these albums. Geez. Just absolutely destroyed these albums. They pulled the plug on the column.
Yeah, no doubt.
This was the example of, what happens when the gatekeeper opens the gate a little too wide.
Right.
But how it influenced the culture, I want to be really careful here, okay? Because in my experience, especially early on, it was still the major labels that drove the community. The real influences were people who had worldwide distribution on LP. Right. So people like Tangerine Dream, Jean-Michel Jarre, Larry Fast, the prog rockers.
Right.
But what the community did was it put people in a position so that when the New Age and electronica worlds combined with the ability to start doing cassette distribution and then CD distribution on a wide stage, they were able to step in. There was a fellow, I don't know what it is about New Jersey. New Jersey, Synthetic Pleasure, and actually, let me say this for the podcast. It just sort of clicked in my head. A lot of the really great musicians came from that part of New Jersey, largely because Synthetic Pleasure made sure that they could know about each other. And among these people, there were folks who never ended up going anywhere, like Lori Paisley. She was actually a great musician, but never took off. Neil Nappa was there, who got discovered by Larry Fast. Larry Fast was there. The Nightcrawlers were there. But then there was a guy in basement in New Jersey doing music, who self-pressed an LP. His name was John Christopher. He had changed his name when he came over, when he immigrated to the United States. And he did this record, and it got the attention of a major label. He networked through Synthetic Pleasure, got the attention of a major label. It was Private Music. And they funded him to do another album. And he went back to using his foreign name, which was Yanni. John Christopher was born...
New Jersey?
Yeah. John Christopher was born Yanni Chrysomelos. And A+M+T, I played the original pressing of A+M+T with a hand-painted cover on my radio show at WRCT Pittsburgh in the 80s. And then Keys to Imagination came out on CD, and it blew up.
Right.
And he's been, riding the wave ever since. But he got his start through the zines.
Unreal.
And he, multi-millionaire, tremendously successful, huge crossover and market reach. And he was one of the guys who was able to ride the wave the whole way. Almost as successful was Steve Roach, right, who of course has his own label and a wide, well-deserved fan base. Robert Rich, who took a slightly different road, but has a tremendous following. And people like Michael Garrison of blessed memory.
Oh, yeah.
Garrison, In the Regions of Sun Return, this gorgeous album, hand-painted LP covers. He pressed, 250 copies, and drove in a van up and down the California coast selling this record to any record store that would take it. And you would get these record stores that would get these collections of obscure music, and they'd put out these catalogs, right, that you would pour over the same way you poured over the Gear magazines, like Eurock,
right,
and Wayside Music. They ended up launching their own labels, Cuneiform Records.
Yeah, I was going to say, those things were like a combination, sort of like the intersection of a catalog and a fanzine.
Exactly.
Because they, when a new release would come out that they would consider important, mm-hmm, instead of being the little typewritten blurb, they'd devote a page to it.
And they'd say, and come here and buy it.
Right.
And you had people like Lloyd Barta at Backroads Music, and a lot of these folks. Garrison himself ran a little catalog for a long time. He died way too young, and he'd done some amazing music. And introduced people to a lot of things. So you had the Pacific Northwest scene, you had the New Jersey scene, you had the Southwest scene and the California scene, and these people. And there were folks who were sort of tootling along in the background who could rely on these catalogs to get the word out about them. And if the guys at Wayside Music gave a nice review to this little cassette from somebody you'd never heard of, you'd spend $8 and give it a try. Sure, why not?
Just because you would know, somebody who sold well. What does that mean? Did that mean 50 copies? Did it mean 250 copies? Did it mean 2,500? I don't know. What does it mean? What was a good sales back then?
Who knows?
Yeah,
and it depended. And again, it depends on the person.
Right.
If Tangerine Dream only sold 2,500 copies of one of their releases, they'd call it a disaster.
Right.
If Steve Roach sold 2,500 copies of one of his first LPs, he was on his
Big
way.
winner.
He was on his way.
Right.
And, and you would get people like these little labels that were getting started in the 80s when LP and later CD pressing became accessible, used these catalogs to get the word out about them. My favorite example is Kerry Limer of Palace of Lights. And I've got two of his early Palace of Lights cassettes. I've got, Music for Land and Water and Installation View. And great stuff.
Beautiful.
And Closed System Potentials, his first LP.
Right.
When he was just getting POL established. So the fact that I actually was able to play on a couple of tracks on a Palace of Lights release is still a big deal to me.
Yeah.
That really established, I think, a zeitgeist that we're missing today. What we have today is this tremendous democratization. And as has been pointed out in many other areas of technology, when something becomes cheap and it becomes democratized, you open the door for anyone to be able to do it, and that's not always necessarily going to result in a good outcome all the way around. When you filter and when you have people who are doing quality control, when you have a gatekeeper, the average level of what comes out goes up. And this is really sort of...
How can you say that, though, without sounding like you're hey, kid, get off my yard? Because, I mean, I have to admit that, I'm sensitive to this because I've been lucky. I was lucky enough to go back to school and do this media studies thing during the height of the embrace of democratization, right? Mm-hmm. So I would get into these furious fights with my instructors about it's important that everyone has a voice. No, it's important for me to hear the voices that I want to hear instead of it being drowned out by the great stack of people.
And this is a different issue. What's the old joke from the old song that Tom Lehrer did about Werner von Braun? Once the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. The fact that there are no tools available for separating out the good stuff from the bad stuff is a separate issue than the fact that there's bad stuff. The fact is you want the door open. Democratization is a good thing, but we don't have the tools yet to easily find what's good. And the real issue here is my good and your good are not the same.
That's true.
You listen. I know you listen. I've seen your CD collection. You listen to music I would never bother with. Yeah. And I've got stuff in my collection that you turn your nose up at. Right. It's not because one of us is right and one of us is wrong. It's because we have different tastes.
Our souls are different.
And the thing is, Darren, this is really what I want to get to. It's not, hey kid, get off my lawn. It's, hey kid, grow your own lawn. Plant a garden and get people to come to you for what you do well. And no, the tools are not good for finding people whose garden has the kind of flowers you like.
Right.
The thing about the early years, and again, it all comes back to the same thing over and over again, the gear magazines, the gear user groups, the fanzines, the catalogs with reviews in them. What it came down to was information traveled at the speed of a mail plane.
Right.
Okay? It took a long time to get anywhere. And most importantly, information was disseminated at the speed of a printing press or a Xerox machine. All right? And that makes a huge, huge difference. And this is something which I think a lot of people have forgotten. Information technology and the dissemination of knowledge has accelerated far faster than the ability of the individual human mind to assimilate it. In the 1980s, you could know everything there was to know because you read 3 magazines a month, you got 8 fanzines a year, there were 4 catalogs you got in your mailbox twice, 3 times a year. You're talking a total of 24 sources of information, maybe, totaling about 1,000 pages.
Right.
In a year, if you read 3 pages a day, you can keep up on that stuff. And it's possible to encompass it all. It's possible to have it all in your headspace. Yes, it was a very limited community. And if you wanted to be in it, you had to have tremendous drive and tremendous patience and a lot of money.
But it's interesting because when you say it that way, it makes me realize something that was really important at that time was not just that you read it all, but that you practically memorized it all.
Uh-huh.
And if you only had to memorize 3 pages worth of data a day,
you could do it.
You could do it because, in fact, you would do it every day.
Yep, I have right here on my shelf in my editorial office here at Recording the complete print run of Home Studio Recording and Recording Magazine and the complete print run of Music Technology. That started out when I was a subscriber. Right. I read the magazine before I ever got involved writing for it and then eventually becoming a member of the editorial staff. And if you go back and look at those zines, the early ones, you'll find Post-it notes and pieces of tape stuck to the pages. Because the whole thing was you didn't just read it and memorize it, you kept it.
Right.
Downstairs in our vault, I've got my entire 30-year collection of keyboard and electronic musician and recording engineer producer and mix and
Polyphony probably.
I've got my issues of Polyphony and all my zines and everything else. You kept the stuff. It was your reference library.
Right.
And nowadays, the thing about the internet is there's a ton of information. It's all instantly available, but there's very little quality control. There's nobody to help you determine whether source A is better and more reliable than source B. There are a whole lot of people who are either well-meaning but deluded, or avaricious, or just plain wrong, who are yelling as loud as the people you need to be listening to. And the formation of community has taken on a new form and new technology, but it's critical because it still comes back to the fact that a human being can only absorb so much information before he or she burns out.
Right.
And the critical thing that helps us is the best way for the vast majority of us to learn anything is by face-to-face dialogue. Mm-hmm. And the thing that we're benefiting from now in the explosion of maker spaces and hacker spaces and meetups.
The meetup thing is it's really shocking because to a certain extent, I think that at one time, there was a utopian vision of a future where you just lived in your home pod and teleported all of the knowledge in that you needed. And that's basically what Google has become. And the result of that is we're like, Jesus Christ, I wish I could find some people to talk to.
Exactly. Vannevar Bush in the 1950s talked about a machine called the Memex, which would be the size of an office desk that would have all the world's knowledge in it.
Right.
You know? And we've got that now, only it fits in our pocket. Right. But that doesn't make it relatable.
No.
And it doesn't make it absorbable. And most importantly of all, it doesn't make it correct.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, I could...
Well, no, I don't know. You know what? I'm not so sure that correctness is the most important value.
It is when you've got somebody writing to me saying, I just got this guy on YouTube with a video telling me that if I buy this one particular microphone, I can do anything with it. I just put it in front of the kick drum and now it's making a funny fizzing noise.
Yeah, right.
Because this guy told me that I'd be happy if I got an RCA ribbon. And, you know, I'm sorry, there is such a thing as information out there that's just plain damn wrong.
All right. Okay. So I'll buy that. And we will posit that you may be more sensitive about that
just
part of it.
Just a little bit.
Being an editor. But I think the other thing though is let's face it, most of what we say, whether it's online or to other people, is opinion.
Oh yes.
It's really useful in a face-to-face environment I can suss out by spending time with you as to whether or not your opinion is going to actually matter to me. Mm-hmm. And I do that based on the t-shirt you're wearing. I do that based on other things you talked about, like music you like, or
absolutely,
you know, what club you go to, or what substance you smoke, or what liquid you drink, or all of those things. Depending on who I am, all those things have different levels of influence on me so that I can properly suss out whether your opinion matters to me or not. I mean, and what was really interesting to me, you know, this goes back to the internet thing, but it kind of relates to all this stuff, was when I first started interacting with sort of like the analog communities, right? I was like, every time someone would say, oh my God, this thing is the most fantastical item ever. And I would like, okay, I gotta go on eBay and find it because this is the most fantastic thing ever. And I'd get it, and it was like, this is not, in fact, the most fantastic thing ever. And why is that? And it was like, okay, that was the very expensive way to suss out whether this person's opinion was going to work for me or not.
I know, right? and that was how it was all done on the internet.
Right.
And, you know, you picked the people you talked to very carefully. And, you know, to this day, I love watching how the interactions among people take place and how they change. Let me tell you a little story. When the first Team Metlay album was recorded in 1990, we had a basement full of people who had never met each other, who had gotten together for 2 weeks in December of 1990 and had built a studio in a basement. We had a Roland M240 line mixer, 24-channel line mixer. We had piles of gear, ridiculous piles of gear, like 5 different computers running 5 different sequencers, all on different operating systems.
Of course.
We had a PC, we had an Atari, we had an Amiga, we had a Mac 2, Macintosh 2, with a color display. Woo-hoo. And I forget what the 5th one was, but we were running Creator and Bars and Pipes, and we had all this gear, and we were in there, composing and writing, and we had a lot of the MIDI analog and digital stuff, and one of the very first chord wave stations.
Right.
Ooh. And into this room walks a kid. He had been in his mid-20s. And this kid was a guitarist. Played in a local reggae band. He was a friend of the house owner. And looked around and just was like laughing. Just like, look at all you eggheads with all this gear. And it's ridiculous. And actually a couple of people got quite irritated with him because it was like, we love doing this. And we flew, in some cases, thousands of miles and paid a lot of money.
Shut your cake hole.
Yes, if you're not gonna dig what we're doing here with the community, you need to go away. Yeah. And you got, he ended up walking out laughing. You interviewed him yesterday.
Herman Soy Sauce
Pearl. He was the laughing young reggae guitarist who had no idea what all this synthesizer crap was all about.
That's hilarious.
And, when I see the stuff that he's doing now with Pittsburgh Modular and the incredible music that's coming out of Tough Sound Recording.
Yeah, the recording work he's doing.
He's basically my brother because we grew up together,
right.
And which is the only reason why I let him into the damn...
Yeah, I'm a reggae guitarist.
At the time, if you had tried to make a snap judgment on this kid based on how he was talking to members of the community, you would have never wanted to talk to him again.
Right.
But it's this dialogue, this face-to-face dialogue that goes on that allows you to say, so-and-so was somebody that I could not work with before, now I can. Right. Sadly, it's also so-and-so was somebody I used to be able to work with, now I can't.
Yeah, and we all got stories about that shit.
Oh, yeah. And, that we shall not darken the day by bringing any of them up.
I was going to say that those wounds still bleed, man.
And best to just let them be.
Yeah.
But the fact is, the zeitgeist of the old magazine world and the catalog world, it was what there was. Yeah. There was no... We couldn't imagine a world that had information like we have today unless we watched Star Trek.
Right.
And yet... so many great musicians got their start and had good careers, and a lot of this music is still out there and being rediscovered. I was incredibly grateful when Mannequin released that Nightcrawler's retrospective.
Yeah.
And Centaur in the UK released some of the early music on cassette only of Chuck Van Zyl. Exquisite stuff.
Chuck Van Zyl.
And he's still out there. He's still doing.
I gotta interview sometime.
You so have to interview Chuck. Chuck's a great guy. He's run Stars and concerts. But what a lot of people don't realize is he's also a phenomenal electronic musician, and he was one of the early lights. Some of his early cassettes, like Runway and Nuclear Winter, are amazing. Absolutely amazing stuff. And he was getting started in the early 80s. He was a DJ on WXPN, was just getting Stars End happening. Uh-huh. He was friends with guys in the Nightcrawlers and actually played with them on occasion. I'm really glad that he's doing what he's doing and he's still out there. I'd love to do a Stars End concert if I ever have the chance. But, Chuck actually got me my first release. Band of Fire, before it was released as a CD on Atomic City, was released on a compilation on Chuck's label, Synchronos. It was on a compilation cassette called Facets.
Oh wow!
And so he got me my first major exposure, and nothing but mad props for the guy. But again, he was one of the people who wanted to do this stuff and did it, and realized that because of the radio station, he was in a unique position to reach out and pull people in. And programs like Stars End and Echoes and Music from the Hearts of Space and The Wave, that's a whole other podcast talking about the influence that they had on people. You'd be messing around on the radio late at night, and you'd find something, and oh my gosh.
Right. Yeah, we need to talk about that too, because that is another podcast. So, we have burned through the time, but before we go, I'm going to ask the controversial question.
The controversial question. Oh, right. I can't wait.
This is the one that'll get me a gig on Fox News, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. But, right next to Bill O'Reilly. I can see it now.
Right. So what happened? What happened with magazines?
The ones that could maintain a reader demographic, that could get information that they needed in a way that they wanted, were able to survive. The ones that are still going today and are successful today are ones that have taken that idea of really good information being given out in a monthly trickle and capitalized on it.
Right.
The reason why Recording Magazine is still strong in the marketplace these days is because we are not trying to be a website or a video blog or a forum. Right. We are a place where people who really want to understand how this stuff works come to read and digest and come back to next month for more information. A lot of what we say you could find on the internet, but it would take you a long time to get it, and it would take you a long time to parse it out. And I should point out that this trend for magazines to be useful in that way is not limited to music. Travel magazines work the same way. Food and wine magazines. Anything that involves a niche market for people who have a lot of money invested. A recording studio, a good recording studio, is still a very expensive proposition. If you're going to be spending that kind of money, you want somebody authoritative who knows what he's talking about. And if he doesn't know what he's talking about, he doesn't shoot his mouth off anyway. Page space is too valuable. He goes out and finds someone who does know what he's talking about. I am not the be-all and end-all expert on the recording of audio. Mm-hmm. But I've got people on my staff who can answer the questions that I can't. My job in this editorial office, as well as at things like the Different Skies Festival, is as an aggregator. Mm-hmm. And aggregation is key. What happened to most of the magazines is they stopped being the only way you got information, and they couldn't deal with shifting their focus and their concentration to be something that enough people wanted to keep paying for. And that's really where things fell apart. If you want to attract someone who wants to read advertisements and pay for good gear, you need to focus your attention on the people who have the interest and the expertise and who want more expertise and who have the money to spend on making music that is better sounding and more professionally created. I really believe that the key to print magazines staying relevant in the next 50 years, so that I can actually put food on the table, is knowing your audience and making sure that your audience gets information that they can really use in a deep and meaningful way at a rate that they can actually absorb. And that is the legacy of the old magazines that is still here today. You produce very high quality material and you deliver it at a rate that someone can take in and really make use of so that they want to come back for more. That's where the win is.
From my perspective, there has to be a future for magazines. Maybe it's not printing on paper, but there has to be some sort of future for that.
Well,
for something that's not crowdsourced, for something that...
Exactly.
And basically, it goes back to this whole idea of opinions that I trust, mm-hmm. and develop and finding a place where those exist.
And a voice. This is what's really critical. Let me talk a little bit not only about my magazine. I want to talk about some of the other magazines out there that are doing it really well. all right? Sound on Sound is kicking ass, all right? Paul White, Gordon Reed, those guys are really good at what they do, all right? They've been around forever. They have good opinions. They deliver their message in a way that's digestible and workable. Another magazine which has, as part of its editorial focus, something which is tremendous that no one else is doing, is Tape Op. When they go out and do interviews with people in all realms of music,
Right.
and
They're
talk
all over the map.
but when they get into it and they talk about it and they get these people to talk about their experiences and their influences, that is a community building tool that is extraordinary. And there is no other magazine in the music world that is doing with its interviews what Tape Op does. That is an amazing book. All right, I'm going to give them mad props. You find a voice. You give your audience what, not only what it wants, but what it needs. And you give it to them in a way that they can digest it, that they feel that they're being respected, that they're not being talked down to, and that if they ask a question, they can come to you and they can get clarification. And if the clarification is important enough, it will get turned into an article and run, and 20,000 or 30,000 people will read it. Anyone can find my email address on page 4 of every issue of Recording Magazine. I answer every email I get because I know I have a responsibility. And that's really the key. That's why scientific journals are refereed. That's why we go through this process of quality control, because I'm asking people for money to read my magazine. I need to know, and they need to know, that they're not going to regret putting down the cash.
Well, and not only regret, but I think you hit something that's really important on the head, and one of the reasons why Recording Magazine not only still exists, but is pretty vital in the industry, is that you don't talk down to people. Now, I would say that Recording Magazine has a very, very specific group of readers.
Well, actually, I joke about this, but there's more truth in it than I'd care to admit. I feel that we're doing well if I get equal numbers of letters saying we're too simple and we're too complicated.
Right.
We try to have stuff that gets people in on the entry level every month, but at the same time, we've got reviewers who can review a $5,000 microphone or a $9,000 pair of speakers and really
and
let
do it in a room with other $9,000
well,
speakers.
but even more important than that, do it in the trenches. One of the things that's different is that the guys that we have writing for us, most notably Paul Vanook Jr., who by the way is well worth a podcast. These are guys who work every day. Paul has done everything from the local punk band down the street to doing work for Sony Pictures. Right. Okay? He's in the studio every day. And if I send him a microphone or a set of monitors or a signal processor or a plug-in, there are going to be albums out on labels that he did learning how this stuff works. And the key to these magazines, it was true of Contemporary Keyboard in 1978, and it is true now. This is a guy with experience whose opinions you trust because he's got the knowledge you don't have yet. Speaking to you in a collegial way about this piece of gear that he was loaned to try out, and he's telling you what it does well, what it does not do well, whether it's a good fit for you, how to judge whether it's a good fit for you. And that's really the key to making these magazines relevant. You don't want some guy on a forum saying, I just spent $1,000 on this and I'm a genius. I just spent $1,000 on this and don't make my mistake. Because when you're talking about this very emotional, I can't believe I did this, or, oh my gosh, look what I did, that puts a veneer over the facts that you got to chip through.
Right.
You can do it. And there are people out there on the forums who have been doing it for years and whose opinions and tastes are well known and who are trustworthy. But when you're getting started, finding those people is very, very difficult.
Right.
And one of the things that the magazines try to do is to give you a ready-made set of collegial friends that you can effectively talk to or listen to and get information that you know isn't going to wind up biting you in the rear. Right. And that's the value, and that's the reason why, yeah, we've got a digital edition. I read, I carry recording around on my iPad. It's wonderful to have 2 years of back issues that I can refer to at a glance. All the magazines are doing it, but it's the format, the idea of someone who not only has the knowledge and the ability to communicate the knowledge, but gives a damn, who doesn't want you wasting your cash. And that's the bottom line. If my readers think that I'm screwing around with them, that's my credibility is my whole card.
Right.
And
you're out of business that quick.
Yes, it's I am very, very lucky. I've been at this magazine for 19 years. All right. We have had the number of times when we've had a review go out that was demonstrably factually wrong can be counted on one hand, easily. We've had manufacturers pull their advertisements because we said things that they didn't like. We've had manufacturers' replies where they basically take a hissy fit on us and make themselves look bad. But to be wrong, to be really wrong, is something that I exert tremendous effort to avoid. If we lose that, if we lose the ability to be trusted, then it doesn't even matter that we're out of business. We've lost our soul.
Right.
There's no reason for me to edit this magazine if I'm not giving people information they can use and trust. Right. It's pointless. So that's my very long-winded answer to your controversial question. Magazines what happened to magazines? A lot of them went away because they tried to be everything to everybody and they tried to stay fashionable. The ones that stuck around were the ones that understood that there are truths that are timeless. And everybody needs to learn them if they're going to be a better musician. And if you communicate those truths in a way that people can absorb, they'll keep coming back.
Well, Mike, I want to thank you so much for your time. It was illuminating and just interesting, just plain interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Darwin. I'm actually more pleased than I can say that I seem to have become Art Music Technology's resident historian.
There you go.
And I would imagine that this podcast is going to generate some press, hopefully positive as well as negative. If people would like to reach me, they can do so through your address that you give out at the end of the podcast every time.
All right.
And if you would like to hear some of my music, I will throw in a quick plug for mrspiral.com, mrspiral.com, which is where you can find free downloads of music that's available for sale, references to my radio show, which is Sunday nights on stillstream.fm. Come by in the chat room and tell me I'm an idiot. I'd love to hear from you. And again, I want to emphasize, you can write to me, mike@recordingmag.com. Okay, my door is open. I answer every email. And it is important to me that I'm reaching this community the way I need to. I'm not an editor of an electronic music magazine. I love synthesis, but what we do is in the pro audio realm. Nevertheless, you're more than welcome to huck a letter over the transom, and I'd love to read it.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right. See you later.
Mm-hmm.
And there you have it, another great episode in the pocket, number 69, Magic 69. So with that, I'm going to let you go for the week, but a couple things. First of all, if you want to get in touch with me or Mike, just shoot something over to me at ddg@cycling74.com. Secondly, as always, if you could, please tell your friends, colleagues, parents, mother-in-laws, whatever, about the podcast and have them tune in. Learn a little bit about the stuff that you're into. And finally, if you have any ideas, comments, or questions, please feel free to hit me up. Again, ddg@cycling74. Otherwise, I'll catch you next week. Bye.